Yeah. Yep.
Recording in progress, got it.
Yes, it is. So welcome to this fifth HYPIA Research meeting devoted to the use of non-English languages in science. The introduction is going to be led by Timothy. So Tim, the floor is yours. I will now stop sharing my screen and allow you to share yours.
Okay, let's hope that this works. Well, firstly, while I'm opening this, I'll try to explain what I was looking at. There were three right. Can you now see languages in science, three manuscripts? Right, yes. So I had to look at the three manuscripts that were sent, which deal with different aspects of the use in language relating to science. And I made this short presentation to summarize what I thought were the salient points. Again, I may have missed some points, and if so, please let me know. The first there were three manuscripts. One was dealing with the use of language as a vehicle for science, in particular Chinese. The second question was not so related to language, but talked about the communication of science, and presumably to different audiences within science, but also to those who don't consider themselves part of the scientific community. The third dealt with maybe the most language-related topic, or the most relevant one for the subject of this discussion, which is the use of non-English, the use of other languages apart from English, and how by ignoring data which is not in English, we may be missing a lot of relevant data and therefore not getting the whole picture. So the first manuscript, I'll just give a short overview now, then I'll talk about each of them in a bit more detail. The first one by Chemla, it was about a dispute between two academics called Broda and Needham about the use of Chinese as a scientific language. And the main points of this article are that language and science don't develop independently of each other. As science progresses, new language emerges, or language is adapted in order to express this science. So language is not something immutable that stays the same regardless of scientific advances. The second paper by Bevan et al. Was about broadening participation in science communication. And the main message is that the science communication as it stands is designed for people who are already interested in science. Okay, so it's, what's the English expression? Preaching to the converted, as it were. And the way in which science is presented should consider people who are not already engaged with science, but also from people who are from communities that may be underrepresented in the scientific world. And that science communication is not, science is science, and you could say it's universal in one sense, but in another sense, it's done by people, for people. So human interaction is also very relevant for science. That's also something that I found as a scientist myself that is not discussed very much. The third paper by Angulo et al. Is about how looking at data in non-English, which is not in English, can enrich scientific knowledge. And it's a paper about biological invasions or invasive species, of a species, well, invading an area where it was not previously. Now, they don't talk about a specific example in this paper, but one example might be, in the Great Lakes of North America, there is invasion by Asian carp, which are doing very well there. That would be an example of an invasive species. So often a summary of the paper is there is a focus on English in scientific research, but this is not without problems. Other people who are involved in carrying out policy on the basis of science, they often don't speak English. Okay, and so the communication with them is therefore more difficult. And also by ignoring the data not in English, you have gaps in the knowledge. And because of these gaps in the knowledge, you can become biased because you're only looking at what English speaking people are reporting. Okay. So now a more in-depth overview of the first article. Now, there's discussion of the idea that the Chinese language may have hindered scientific development in China. And there's discussion of the so-called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that the way in which you speak shapes the thought and therefore the science that is produced. And a related hypothesis is that some languages are therefore better suited for scientific activity than others. Okay, so does the Chinese written language, does that hinder the development of scientific thinking in China? One should remember that the way in which a Westerner might look at science may be different from the way in which a Chinese person might look at science. And the main message for me was that there has been evidence of development of mathematics in China, which resulted in the development of technical languages, which added actually to the Chinese language. And so the Chinese language is not something fixed that shapes the thoughts of the people who carry out science using that language, but also science influences the way in which the language develops. So they shouldn't be seen as two things that are separate from each other, but two things that influence each other, both of scientific knowledge and language. Okay, so the second paper by Bevan et al. About improving participation in science and technology and engineering, these fields. There are four main problems. Firstly, that the people who organize such activities have quite narrow definitions of what science, technology, and engineering is. Okay. A second problem is that science, the way in which science is represented, tends to favor cultural norms. So it is often seen as being something that white people do, that Western people do, and that men do. And such activities also neglect the fact that the people who are taking part in them will have existing knowledge. And also there's not so much thought about how the science communication will lead on to something else or bigger in the future. Also, there is a problem that people who are involved in science communication are seen, science communication is seen in institutions like universities as being less important than science itself. And so it's not something that is generally a priority, for the department. And in my own experience of working at universities, I'm not trying to point the finger at any university in particular. I've never seen science communication, ironically, being given a very high profile within the university, but that's just my personal experience. Okay. And that despite the fact that we're told as scientists, to express, our science and its novelty, in a way that's understandable to a wider sort of audience. So the authors make some suggestions to widen participation. They talk about boundary objects that may serve as points of discussion for different sections of society. They don't give it many concrete examples, in my opinion, but for some reason, an artifact or a statue or might be seen differently by people who come from different sections of society, and that might be a way to start a dialogue. And then by presenting people who run such activities with briefs, that it might get them thinking about if their activities are really as inclusive as they're supposed to be. And the authors suggest that all change has to start slowly with small steps, and then hopefully it will become lead on to larger changes. And the third paper is again about these invasive alien species which move from one environment to another, and usually in an undesirable way. So there was the example of the Asian carp, which do very well in the Great Lakes of the United States and Canada because they don't have natural predators there. Now, the authors in this study looked at data on the economic costs of such events in 15 non-English languages, and also in English documents, okay? And what they found was that if you look at this graph here, you have here in black the papers which are published in English, so are not in English, which are comparable with papers, published in English, which are in white. The gray papers, those are published in, again, not in English, but the way in which the data is presented, if I understand correctly, is not compatible with the other studies. But the main important things are the black and the white, the studies with comparable costs, and how many of them are in English and how many of them are not in English. And actually, there are slightly more not in English than in English. So if you were only to look at the English part of the pie, as it were, the white part, then you would be missing a lot of comparable data, about half of it. And then you would also be missing data which might be relevant in gray, although it might not necessarily be comparable. You'll also notice with what these letters mean, okay, like SP is what's written in Spanish, FR is what's written in French. So you can see that in parts of the world where presumably where Spanish or French is spoken, there's a lot of data that's being written, and maybe in these places invasive species are more problematic, who knows, than in other parts of the world where people are collecting data in English. Okay, so in short, if you only have English, you only see part of the picture. Now, here's another graph from the same paper, and this shows the number of entries that are not made in English, basically, compared to the number of English speakers present. So, and of course, in the pink area where people speak English, then nearly everything is in English. But in many places where people don't speak English, so for instance, places like where people speak Spanish or French or Russian, there are lots and lots of entries with data on invasive species which are not in English. Okay, so I mean, stands to reason, if people don't come from a place where English is spoken, you're going to have fewer reports in English, less data in English. And this is, I think, another way of basically saying the same thing. Here you can see the world, and if you look at this, what's the word, this checkered or this thatched, I don't know how you say it in English actually, area, that's
Sorry,
where...
2 minutes.
Oh, right, yeah, so I'm almost there. So you get this, that's where you have species in the English database, and where in the cross ones is where you have not in English. And where you see red, green, the stronger the green color basically means that the contribution, which is not in English, is greater. So in Latin America, in some countries in Europe, and also in Russia and China especially, there's a lot of data that's there that isn't being reported, in English. And these pie charts basically say the same thing. So findings, if you don't take the non-English data into account, you have biases, okay? And they recommend that you combine the data from English and non-English sources so you have better completeness of the data, fewer biases, and then it will also, you'll have better performance in executing decisions on the basis of the data as well. So, and this in some areas such as conservation science, about 1 in 3 papers are ignored because they're not in English, and that's conservation is a worldwide topic. And oh, do I not have? Well, I'm sorry. I thought that I had 3 questions here at the end. Obviously, I've made a mistake, but the 3 questions I'd like to ask I made are: firstly, is the use of English as a language for science, might that be discouraging people who write science in a different style from native English speakers or from speakers of European languages? The second question was, okay, it was related to the second point. Yes, is the use of English in outreach activities in science communication, does that lead to less inclusivity from certain communities, and what can we do about that? And the third question is, what can we do to promote the scientific community to pay more attention to literature that's not written in English? Okay, sorry for going over time there, but thank you for listening. Do you have any questions to me in particular?
All right, thank you so much, Tim. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I think the summary was brilliant and everybody got the gist of what each article was about. And the questions were really pertinent, so I'm hoping that this can spark some interesting debate. I will now share the screen and we can proceed with the debating question. And before we start with the debate, I just wanted to say that I think that there is a certain essentialism in both the inclusion of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and the way some questions I think are addressed. So when we speak about native speakers of English or any other language, but particularly English, where this question has been explored more than anywhere else, what does that mean? That means that that person was born knowing how to write exemplary Spanish. Does that make that person's competence in that language superior necessarily to others? So I think it's important to problematize that because it partakes from the essentialism that is also implicit in the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis taken to the extreme, in the idea that if your first language is Chinese, then you cannot possibly do science in such a way, in the same way people whose first language is English do. So I think that's an important point of contention. Be it as it may, let's start the debate. Count to have a better grasp of who is raising their hand, and so then I can allocate participation. Okay, so if you just excuse me for 1 second, we'll start the debate in like 30 seconds. I need to log in first. Okay, now I'm here. And now I can see who's raising their hands. So Victor wants to participate.
All right. I can talk about some aspects of language and science. But I would like to start by quoting Brazilian statistic from the year 2018. In our country, according to a study made, official study made, 1/3 of the citizens is analphabet, functionally analphabet. That means they may have had some instructions, but they are unable to read more than
I think we lost
paragraph.
We lost connection there, Victor. Could you please repeat what you were saying?
Okay, I'll introduce again. I was telling that by official statistics, 1/3 of our citizens in Brazil are functionally analphabets. That means they can't be read more than a small paragraph and understand them. They can't do small calculation in their heads mentally. Of the people that have reached graduation, 34% of those people don't have proficiency in Portuguese. That means they can't read a 300-word text and construct something, a critics of the text. And of the people who have graduation to 4% to 6% also are functionally diabetic, functionally analphabetic. That is as an example because from all research produced from Brazil internationally, most of it is produced by doctors and masters. We can do research locally in Portuguese, but that's when you compare, when you think about language and science, it's a comparator. Well, when I made my master's in evidence-based healthcare, we did a major research of many studies of many languages. Cochrane initiative doesn't admit language bias in Cochrane in meta-analysis because they believe it's not significant. But among the files I found, among the studies I found, I had studies in French that were never spoken, written in English. I had Dutch studies never produced in English. And most of all, I had 2 studies produced in German that were never produced in English, and they didn't have the minimal wish to produce that in English. So that's something to think about, because I believe science is produced in other languages. Okay, science is translated to English, but I believe all languages are capable of some science.
Okay, so all languages are capable of some science. All languages are capable of some science, says Victor. Does anybody want to? Yeah, Anja?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
So yes, going back to the question, what language is appropriate to be a language of science, or should every language be the language of science? If I respond to that Shemla's theory that like every language deserves to be the language of science, because if we don't translate into all the languages, those languages don't get new vocabulary, and with this, we endanger those languages. They can disappear. They won't be used anymore just because of those 1 or 2 basic languages that might be used in science. So I am so strongly against not translating and using just 1 language. I don't know what happens or what happened in your countries, but I remember in 2016 we have a 19 Act. I don't know if I said it correctly in English. It was like a new law where they suggested that we would use English as a main language in the high school. So in medicine and science, they wanted to just have classes in English, which means I speak Slovenian and I'm talking about Slovenia. So here we speak Slovenian language. We fought so much to have a country, to have an ability to speak the language, so that our language would be valued, appreciated as a language in which poetry, science, philosophy can be expressed. And now we are willingly accepting that the language is not appropriate to have science classes or discussion or writings in it. And this is actually very interesting because in Germany, for example, they accepted this law, and when in 2016, now also they wanted to accept it in Slovenia, they realized that in Germany they made a mistake by accepting this new law because, of course, you endanger your language, right? What do you think? What experience do you have from your countries? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Anja. That was a very important reflection. I just wanted to add before moving on that yes, there seems to be some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, whereby if we believe that a certain language is not amenable to science and we don't use it, that makes it even less amenable to science, etc., etc. So it's a vicious cycle from there on. And I also want to point out to the fact that translating into languages other than English is not the same as producing and accepting production of science in languages other than English. So translations do help, but are they the same as producing science in non-English languages to begin with? I think that there is a gap there. And Gaia wants to participate.
First of all, I want to thank Tim for the brilliant work he did in presenting the 3 materials. Actually, when I was choosing the reading materials, I made a big collection of different articles, and there was a large forum in 2020 talking about the languages of science. So this is a very actual problem now at present. And the people are looking for solutions because actually there is already a crisis, not only for the languages and language of science in general, but also for English as a language of science communication. When I was preparing for this presentation, I made a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm not sure if I can share it now, but I would like to share because
Hey, let me just stop sharing mine so that you can share yours, because otherwise you cannot. Let me just stop sharing. Now you can start sharing.
Let me try. I think that no. Well, this is open now.
You just see it below, right? In the middle, it says share screen.
Yeah, I opened already the presentation. Now I will try to share it with the group. Share screen. This one.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is what I had prepared. It's around like only 10 slides. I will be very quick, and partly I will try to answer the questions that Tim raised here, and I think this will be an organical continuation of our debate. So I wanted to tell about my languages of science, my experience, and I think that it will also represent the situation of languages of science in a whole region as the Soviet Union was the Soviet Union. You know that it's a multicultural, multilingual country, and for over 60 years there was developing the science, and Russian was considered to be the international language in this community, in this society. So actually everyone in the Soviet Union who was getting education, we were becoming bilingual from school, which means the native language. Mine was Armenian and then Russian. And by the time I came to university, I was already trilingual. And my first research was in Armenian. Why am I going into details? To show how the native language affected the research process of thinking as a scientist, and how the change of language diminished, I would say, the potential of creativity. The first one was a literary analysis of an Armenian poet, and I remember my myself playing with the language and creating words and new concepts and new visions of the world. So later, when I had to write my graduation paper about the English in Armenian common vocabulary, most of it was terminology connected with science also. I remember my supervisor requiring me to write my paper in Armenian, although it was required that we write and defend the paper in English, because I was doing my degree in English teaching in TESOL. So my supervisor, she was so wise to tell me that I have to do the research, I have to write my ideas in my native language in order to feel free to express all the images and differences of vision. And only after that, she asked me to translate. When she was sure that I know what I'm talking about, she asked me to translate the paper into English. While translating the paper into English, I came to understand that I'm developing a new vision, because when you are talking in a different language, you are talking to a different audience with a different mentality, with a different conceptual system to which you have to adapt your speech. The same thing happened later in Moscow when I went to do my PhD. I translated all my linguistic knowledge to Russian to be able to communicate my thoughts and ideas. It was a comparative study in Russian. Of course, together with learning the new theoretical concept, because every country, especially knowing the Iron Curtain of the Soviet period, they are developing their own conceptual system. However, talking about this, the effect of language on thinking, I'm sure that you know, but I just want to remind you that starting 1920s, in Moscow, the Soviet psychologists and psycholinguists, because aside from Chomskyan psycholinguistics, it was developing also in the Soviet Union. There were very solid studies of cultures and languages, and the mentalities, the thinking, the way of conceptualizing the world by the 150 nationalities of this country. And it was being done not just for the sake of science, but for political and economic, for unifying purposes. They had to understand these different mentalities of different people. So talking about Vygotsky, Luria, Bernstein, yes. I heard, Carlos, your presentation, and also I listened to Tim's podcast about Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and the former Russian people like Lera Boroditsky, and there are also other, Pavlenko, I think, and there is someone in Australia, I don't remember the names now. These are the former Soviet people who are very well familiar with the studies conducted by Luria, Vygotsky, Bernstein, and Leontiev. And this was about the different.
Okay, Gaia, we need to move to the next speaker. We have 5 minutes limit. So if you want to add something to summarize that before we can move to Usman.
Okay. So I want to summarize then. So what I wanted to do, when I created this reading list, I made a selection from a very big one. And in case this is recorded, you can zoom in and check the information, because the problem is reflected in the titles. And the problem actually has several statements that English has hosted the science and technology language, and it's the positive. There are a lot of positive things that has been stated for the world, for the development of science in the world. However, there are different opinions concerning how it will continue. And here are the reasons. I'm just fixing this for the recording. Later, you can go through it when you have the time. So the opinion split, and there are different reasons that have to be considered. The cognitive epistemological reasons, why there should be other languages too, the linguistic reasons. Anya already spoke about that point, and scientific reasons that scientists don't get enough attention, and the economic reasons. That's why the selection of the articles was, I tried to reflect all these aspects of the question. And the crisis of English itself. The language itself is breaking into parts and is not serving the function that would serve if it was culturally located and focused. Next, what are the solutions? There are two types of solutions that are suggested now in literature and in forums and conferences. The first one is the mild and complementary solution. So the suggestions are, let's translate, let's do more TESOL, let's etc., diversify the genres, etc., diversify the communication. And the radical solution, when they say that no, each country, each people have the right, it's their natural right to do science in their own languages, and how to communicate, there are different technical solutions for this. But the radical solution is to decolonize methodologies. That's why there was the third article suggested to your attention about the knowledge that is lost when it is not presented in English. So coming to the last point, why science should speak multiple languages. So imagine a language is a web or a net of meaning. There are some common patterns with large notes and some finer, more unique ones, which are culturally specific. And these are not only culture, this is the culture of thinking, rationalizing the world and creating knowledge. So through these patterns of that web, we structure the perceivable world. Of course, when we speak multiple languages, this conceptual net becomes finer. And why science should speak multiple languages? Again, the second statement, we experiment and play with the first conceptual linguistic net we are given as children. So the more we use and get ownership of our language, the flexier it works for us. The scientific mind, the curious mind, is more effective when it spends less effort on following language rules. Process, it takes break, changes the rules, and language create new images and verbal shapes. So what I want to say that the creative mind, the scientific mind, should not focus on language rules. When English is given as the language of science, naturally the colors become more vague.
All right, thank you, Gaia. We need to move on, and then we can go back to any specific questions, but really,
And
like, interventions need to be limited to 5 minutes.
One last minute.
I'm really sorry about that.
The conclusions here.
Usman, we can go back to them, but we cannot do a whole intervention of 10 minutes because that's not the purpose of the debate. Purpose of the debate is to have quick interventions and then move on from different speaker to speaker. Thank you. Usman, wants to add something?
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Tim. Thank you for that case study as well, Gaia. So because I want to build on that and give another example from here, which speaks to what Tim was saying as well. It is the case study of Pakistan and the language disparity in science. The official language of Pakistan is English, but the national language is Urdu, and then there's ethnic language. Science was, for a long time, taught in English. And so if you had an English access education, you'd do fine. But then there was a movement to try to put it into Urdu, and it became very awkward because the people didn't have the rudiments of the etymology of the words. They didn't understand where these words derive from. And so they needed a basis in Arabic and Persian, which they didn't have. So now there's two tiers. Many people still do it in English and some do it in Urdu. And what it's done is stratified science. And it's made it awkward. And one conclusion from this today, which is a crisis, is that people actually relegate science to, they have a different attitude towards science, as if this was a foreign thing or a Western thing, which speaks to the biases that Tim brought up earlier. And so when it comes to something like COVID-19, the benefit here is that the people did not contest it the way in some democracies in the West. You have people saying it's my right and they just don't wear a mask and they ruin everybody's day. Instead, the people here in general said, okay, this is something for the experts to do. And most of the scientists running that came from the WHO, Geneva, that sort of experience, and they did manage it. So this is one of those Praetorian examples of having the bureaucrats run it, and it's fine. But the people's connection to that, most people here would probably say, this thing isn't even real. This COVID thing isn't real, but I'll let the experts do what they need to do. So what it does, this stratification in society, is distort people's engagement with science. And so I, for example, if I have to communicate something that is very in the natural sciences, I would use English. But things like the social sciences, there's a long history of that in Urdu. So economics, philosophy, law, jurisprudence, etc., all exist. But the natural sciences, because they've advanced so much in, let's say, the last 70 years, the vocabulary didn't exist. And when I tried to work on Urdu Wikipedia, we built it, 16 of us. There was a lot of consensus building on what the word should be. So the word for computer is not computer because it doesn't compute in the modern day. It actually aggregates, it's an aggregator of data. And so the etymology of computers are not, they're aggregate. That sort of debate became very intense. And so science is now stratified here. Sometimes it turns out good accidentally, but in the spirit, it's not a good thing. That's all I'd like to say. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Usman. That stratification of science is very relevant indeed. Is there anybody who hasn't participated yet who would like to add before we start the second round of participation? So who hasn't participated yet? Essentially, Matthias. Matthias, would you like to add some contribution before we start the second round?
Of course. The use of English as a common language in science arise several questions. First of all, the use of English as a lingua franca, but not only because the same factors of creation and destruction of language and culture as, for example, territorial conquest, trade and commerce, religious imposition, and cultural industry. Not only about that. The use of English as a common language in science, and first of all, almost every scientific, at least in the Western world, chooses English for practical reasons. Secondly, the pressures of the global market. Most of the people who are dedicated to science belong to, for example, medical corporations or another researching corporations, and I mean the internationalization of that mise en place of that common ground uses English as a lingua franca only because as unfortunately any other polyglot meeting normally uses English as a common language. The third point is the lack of time to learn other language among a teamwork or among a scientific community, or at least lack of time for the members of a teamwork to know nuances and nonverbal information or some kind of associated information that other language has, and it relies and it appreciates very important to contribute to that research. So in the very same effort to put a lingua franca, any of one, either English or even any other given language, to speak every one of us, a common language for research purposes. At the same time, they are ignoring that other languages have a lot of richness to contribute to that very specific researching, to the very specific investigation. For example, Hindi or Chinese, or I don't know, even Arabic. There are a lot of languages of our respective background that can contribute with such specific meaning, with nuances that English lacks, for example. And up to the point, those three matters. If I have another matter, I will tell you.
All right, thank you, Matthias. That was wonderful. Very systematic, and all points were relevant to the debate. Thank you. Now we have three hands raised. I think first was Victor, then Timothy, and then Anya, if I'm not mistaken. Let's go with Victor first.
Okay, thank you. Very good, the presentation of Guy. I wish he can come share the presentation to us because it was very significant. I would like to point some things. Dollar has been the main the money of the world for some times, and it's giving way to euro and to pound in my vision. Then, so as the to language, I believe English is not so important as lingua franca as it was before. I do believe it's changing. But I would like to point some things. It was a Chinese scientist who had the first experiment of CRISPR, making an embryo totally changed by genetics in the embryo. Cuba has made some other experiments too. So besides language, I would like to point out that there is an ethics to science that may be different from country to country. For philosophy, I wouldn't go to other language than German. Gestalt, the word Gestalt is never translated correctly. The word robot in most languages came from robotnik, which is a worker, robotic worker in the industrial sciences, industrial times. So the language intermingles. I have been studying Russian, and I've been studying now for some months Russian through medical books. And they have good medical books. And I've studied through books of science for graduation, for schools, and they are good. So I don't believe there is a language for science. They speak differently. If you think science in a Russian book, in a Russian school book, in a Russian medical book, and you give way of thinking English, we will think it differently, but that's science too. So I do believe polyglots have a very, very good advantage in that.
Mm-hmm.
That's about it.
All right, thank you, Victor. Tim is next.
Right, yeah. Thank you for your reactions. Keep me to 5 minutes because I could talk for hours. But to bring up some of the points that were mentioned, what Usman was saying about science being seen as foreign in Pakistan because it's in English, and also what Anya, you were saying that because more science is done in English, people don't value their native language as much as they could. And it also, I think that even in an English-speaking country where I live, there is still a gap between the academic world and the world outside, even without any language barrier. So I think that in other countries, I think Usman's example is quite extreme, but if you have communities where there are lots of people who come and they speak English and they don't learn the local language, as I've seen often in Germany, and especially in countries where Dutch is spoken, that cannot be good for promoting dialogue between or making people think that the academic world is part of society, which is actually what we want. And when I worked in the Netherlands and also in the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, I noticed that sometimes I never saw ever encouragement to speak the local language. So I was one of the few foreigners who spoke Dutch. Now that was appreciated, but I never saw anybody else encouraging other people to speak it. And some cases, I even saw local people saying, "Oh, don't bother to learn Dutch because everybody will just reply to you in English," which is nonsense actually. but it just shows that even these people who have learned English as a lingua franca don't appreciate all the aspects of language, that they see it as only being something for communication, or, well, I mean, transmission of information, and not as something that you can use to build, relationships. I mean, that's something we haven't sort of discussed so much today, but why I think the scientific world is wonderful is because you can learn languages doing science. So instead of looking for a common language that everybody uses, I believe actually exploiting the scientific world to actually learn all these other languages and make more meaningful relationships with people from other countries, which is good for science. But what I also wanted to point out, there's also a difference when it comes to publishing. There's a difference between different cultures. So in the English-speaking world, we are encouraged generally to have fewer but high impact papers. I know from my Russian colleagues, for instance, that there's a different publication culture where they are encouraged to have more papers, but maybe the impact is not so great. And so this encourages, of course, publication in Russian-speaking journals where they can publish quickly so they can fulfill their goals. So they remember that it's not just I think the English-speaking world and also countries where English, in Western Europe, the scientists are judged by different standards than people in other parts, of the world. And I think that's also something that should be, borne in mind.
Definitely, Tim. It's very important to take into account different publication cultures, which these are also different in the US and in Spain, of course. Yeah, definitely. Something that needs to be considered. Now, Anja's next.
Yes, actually, I would like to continue what Timothy already said. Like, there's a difference between how the language of science is used in science and how in education when they teach you about science. So because of publishing in certain language so that it would be possible to read it for the higher population, they mostly decide to write in one or the most common languages. But yet when it goes to education about science, they have to appreciate the different languages and share the knowledge in the native languages of countries where they teach those languages, right? But I would also like to say discuss a little bit about the language in science. So there's a difference how those articles are possible to get if you are a specialist, but yet they are not possible to get them if you are just like a common person. Because even though you might know the language, there's no special place where they will post all of those articles. I know mostly people Google or go to the Google Scholar and get those articles, but yet there is not, as far as I know, there is not one common site or online newspaper or something where in all the languages it would be possible to post new discoveries and in all kind of sciences nowadays. And there should be like some polyglots who just translate synopsis in different languages so that people can actually get in their own native languages the most amount of information they want. I remember from my research and different topics actually and different sphere, not science, but yes, I struggled so much to find important data in different languages. If you want to make it sure it's valuable and to check the ideas and discoveries in different languages, there is no common place where you can get all the information. So at least for science, and to get all access to those new articles, I think there should be some special place where all the science articles could be posted. I don't know if any of you already know some of those pages. I would be really happy to know them, or if it's possible to get access, even if you're just a common person, not a doctor or something, a specialist. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, open access and accessibility in general also has an impact in the languages that we use in science. So it's a really important angle to consider. I wonder whether the economic incentives that are intertwined with publishing practices in science would allow for an open access repository of every single scientific article. Usman may have something to say about this.
About the about the PowerPoint I have received, Shneur Hagalem.
Matthias, let's wait for Usman to speak, and then you can speak next.
Sure. Continue.
Thank you.
Yes, Anya, I have a site to recommend to you after this. I have a funny anecdote, but it's very relevant to Tim, which you've brought up right now. We're talking about science, and that's our core, but it helps to contrast with the social sciences. So I just sent a paper this year to a very prestigious public policy journal, and they said it's a solid paper, excellent paper. You normally don't get generous reviews, but here's something interesting that they said at the end of the review. It's anonymous, right? So they didn't know where I was from or that I'm a native speaker of English. They said, written expression is a little awkward and clumsy in various places. I would suggest a careful proofing and preparation of the manuscript, or if the author's first language is not English, having the paper professionally proofed. Okay, I'm sloppy, but it wasn't so bad that I'm not a native speaker. And what I'm trying to connect that with is the fact that sometimes, because it's anonymous, sometimes it's subjective, right? So sometimes something badly written, you just think I'm probably a foreigner. And what I'm really getting at from that is the difference between the science and the social sciences, because if you look at the foreign and like in Western countries, who the ethnics are in terms of professors, where do you find them? You find them often in mathematics, the natural sciences, computer science, far fewer in something like political science or public administration, disciplines that require a lot of philosophizing and writing, because you really have to master that language in order to compete at that point. So for example, you and I, so in a PhD in mathematics, you could write a 16-page proof and you're done. But in public administration, you'd have to write a good 200 pages or something, and it has to be very well done. So if you actually find fewer ethnics, and I mean that in terms of like foreign faculty coming from abroad where English isn't normally spoken as the dominant language, they actually come in fewer numbers because of that. So it helps to contrast that. Actually, science is a bit luckier, although all of the points you've made are absolutely right, but it's actually a bit worse in the social sciences. I'd point that out. So even I get things like get somebody to help you out if you don't know English. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful anecdote, Usman. Yes, reviewers sometimes can make those type of comments, and they do oftentimes. Who's next? Who else hasn't? Oh, Matthias was next. Go ahead.
Well, finding a common ground for science, it's not easy per se. However, I wonder why sometimes we don't. So why don't we consider, or why right now we are not considering languages different from English as a common ground, at least if those researches are at the national level. For example, research made in Chinese, in Mandarin for China, exclusively for China, or research made in Russia, or a research made in France, or something about the local market. My question arises about the internationalization of a given research, and in which context we establish English as a common ground. Sometimes I figure out. Sometimes I realize that the use of English as a lingua franca among an international research is somewhat forced. It's some kind of forced situation, and which interest that decision obeys. Some of them I told you previously, but the point is to let the ball bouncing in your half court. Why do we encourage to use other language as a research language, regardless being a common ground or not? Just that.
Okay, thank you, Matthias. So now we've all spoken except for Gaia in this round. Gaia, do you want to go back to the presentation or touch upon any of the topics?
No, I want to thank everyone. I'm contented because I sent already my PowerPoint by email to everybody. So there is the list of literature which will tell you the story. The anecdotic cases are like how English became the language of physics and mathematics written by mathematicians. Just go through the list. It will be already itself an interesting story. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, Gaia. And now we will initiate the next round if somebody wants to add to what is already been said. Let me address this more presentation. Team is having trouble opening that presentation because of the format. Is it a PPTX, PPT? Yeah.
PPTX is the PowerPoint, but in the later versions of Office.
Yeah.
Right.
It's PowerPoint. It's PowerPoint. I will try to send it again if you don't get it. Just let me know. Maybe later when you try, you will open it. I don't know. Otherwise, it is already recorded with this meeting, right?
Yes. Any other comments? Okay, so if there are not any further comments.
Tim has something to say, sorry.
Oh yeah, sorry. Tim, go ahead. Thank you.
Yes, just very briefly to come back to what Usman was saying, that the natural sciences might be a bit more forgiving than the social sciences regarding language knowledge. I just wanted to point out that I think based on my experience in Germany and also in Dutch-speaking countries, my impression is that in the United Kingdom and in the United States, you see more diversity among the professors, which you see to a lesser extent in Germany and an even lesser extent in Dutch-speaking countries. And I suspect that as a foreigner, you face a double challenge, that you have to be good at what you do, but at the same time, you also have to be accepted as one of them or seen as not being foreign anymore. And I have seen people who have become well accepted in such cultures, but you can see that they have made an effort, particularly with the language, to master German or Dutch so they can cope with all situations in such languages, even if they don't speak it perfectly. So I think that's also an important role that we haven't discussed for languages in science, is actually for career advancement. Although for all the talk of that some people make about having a universal language in English, people are still people, and they want to work together with people who are like them and who they can relate to. So I think the role of languages for career advancement in science should definitely not be underestimated.
Yeah, that's a very important comment, Tim. And I will add to that sometimes language proficiency is not enough either. So some institutions in higher education, for instance, in the US where I work, simply do not sponsor visas for foreigners. So it doesn't, at that point, even if the language proficiency is there and anything else is there, and you're really good at what you're doing, that may not even matter in some cases.
Or even though a research made in a specific language is not considered outside the borders of that country for political reasons, as another possible fact, as another possible reason.
Right.
It's a huge debate.
Any more comments? Sorry. Thank you, Matthias. Any more comments, thoughts? All right, Victor is celebrating already. So the next topic will be, if I'm not mistaken, next month it will be presented by Anja. Is that correct? On the divine elements and nature of some alphabets, including Sanskrit and Hebrew.
I wanted to go also in the direction of the language of the gods or the gods, and what can be discussed in this direction if you're interested, or maybe even how reciting or speaking those languages or praying in those languages changes your brain structures. Like, I don't know, I find some researches, but I hope it will be interesting.
Sure, excellent. So the topic is already decided, and so is the presenter. So we won't be having the debate that we normally have between different options. Matthias wants to share something. Ibrit.
Translate, please.
Kaya?
Armenian also has an interesting system related with the numbers, letters, prayers, and all is accumulated in the Armenian alphabet. I guess there is some information on the Wikipedia for your reference, Anya.
Thank you. I just knew that about the Hebrew letters, but I will check now that I know also Armenian, if there is like some similarity. Thank you.
It's a whole cosmological system dating 3001.
All right, awesome, excellent.
301.
Excellent. So thank you very much, everybody, for this wonderful seminar, and I'll see you in the next HYPIA Research meeting. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.